Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research for the release of our May 2020 review, in which we concentrate on trying to understand the terrible economic crisis that's confronting the UK and the rest of the world. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Amit Kara, our Head of Global Economics, Gary Young, our Deputy Director, who's going to talk about the prospects of the UK economy, and Rachel Tukey, who will act as our Master of Ceremonies when we get to the Q&A in about 30 or 40 minutes or so. Now, in constructing this forecast, we've had to make a number of key assumptions in a world of immense and enormous uncertainty. Gary later on and Ami will both outline the uncertainty and indeed the risk the global and the UK economies are facing. The key assumptions underpinning our view are the assumptions of the duration of the lockdown, as well as a careful bottom-up and top-down analysis of what the lockdown does to growth here and abroad. Amit later on will talk in detail about the interactions that are amplifying the downward momentum in the global economy. So as well as taking a view on the direct impact of the lockdown and its duration, we have to also take a view on the extent to which it can be phased out over time. And because the fluctuations in the world economy brought about by this lockdown swamp any normal fluctuations that we would see quarter to quarter when we do these forecasts. And bear in mind, the Institute has been forecasting since 1959. They dominate any other views that we might have. And so later on, you'll get some idea of the magnitude of the fluctuations that we're trying to map out and consider at the moment and contribute to public understanding at this very difficult time for all of us, and in particular, policymakers. For those of us who follow the National Institute, we will know regularly that we examine monetary and fiscal responses to shocks that come along. And so we'll devote quite some time this morning to looking at the monetary and fiscal policy options that may be carried out. This throws open a number of issues that we've talked about regularly over the last few years. Issues of coordination both domestically between monetary and fiscal policy, globally, the extent to which the fiscal and monetary policies that are being carried out to help stabilize the economies should be coordinated in a better form. To what extent should we worry about fiscal dominance over monetary policy? What kind of targets should we have in place of fiscal policy? And also, what instruments might be deployed in order to limit the risks faced by individuals and the overall uncertainty that the global economy is confronting at this moment? We've argued for a number of years that arbitrary fiscal rules serve little purpose, and what we need to think very hard about are targets related to an overriding social welfare criterion. Monetary policy in this crisis can provide support, but it should not be set up in such a way as to undermine long-run price and financial stability. And we mustn't lose the hard-won and important goal of operational independence. Now, if we map out our view of the UK economy, and the UK as a semi-small, open economy with extensive global links, has a very high correlation or beta with world activity. And I have here a particular path that Gary will discuss shortly when we come to talk about the UK. And what you can see is the red line prior to the crisis, excuse me, the black dotted line was our previous expected path, central case for the UK in February, just a couple of short months ago. And what we've done is taken a particular view as to how the crisis and the lockdowns may unfold. And what you see is the rapid decline in this quarter, a large part of a return in the next quarter, and then the gap between the red line that we're now nudging along and the black dotted line gives an indication of the kind of scarring we expect. The overall cost to the economy from this gap is some £800 billion. And Gary will come on to that a little bit later on. To guide us, we've had a hard look at 1921. There was a box in the review, which we'll make available to participants after the seminar, in which there was a very sharp decline in the second quarter of 1921, with a fall of some 12 to 15%, and a rebound of a similar magnitude the following quarter. Now, I want to be sure that everyone understands we don't think that this forecast is anything other than highly uncertain. But this is one particular reassuring path that might just about happen, I guess, if we're lucky. When we turn on to consider the fiscal policy imperative, we think the current conjuncture is still a little bit short of what's required. And I think Gary and both Amit will discuss these in more detail shortly. The guiding principles of fiscal policy is to consider the quantum of risk the public sector can absorb, and to that extent offset the risk the private sector is currently facing. Recall that lockdowns are an economic instrument that we agree with, but are used to control the spread of COVID-19, but are impacting very heavily on economic outcomes. Having decided on the quantum of risk to absorb and the uncertainty wishes to offset, fiscal policy then must decide to allocate a certain quantity of resources to transfer back to the private sector. And some areas to consider. Because of the lockdowns, the labour supply is constrained, but there are clearly some shortages as well as excesses in some areas. Perhaps labour could be diverted. It's also clear that the economic shock falls more heavily on families in lower income decades, and this point is also amplified or echoed overseas, where the shock is more likely to fall more heavily on poorer countries. Indeed, the COVID-19 shock interacts with poverty to make it worse, in our view. We think at the government level, both national and regional governments need to be ready to kickstart projects when and if it's safe to ease lockdowns. And our final view is that fiscal multipliers in a world in which demand is being rapidly suppressed, at the point at which some of the lockdowns may be eased, may be quite large this time. We may recall a debate from a decade ago arguing that fiscal multipliers may not be very large. We think this time there's likely to be considerable room for fiscal policy to have an impact. And so the question then would be, what should monetary policy be thinking of doing? Well, the conventional space is reasonably well mapped out. It could buy more debt. It's started to do so. It could consider buying riskier assets, increasing the balance sheet further. There are gaps in forward guidance. The bank doesn't yet publish interest rate forecasts that we think would help support some expansionary monetary policy. And there may be some room for negative policy rates. We're looking at evidence, particularly from the ECB, that suggests that this has some stimulatory effect. When we head into unconventional space, the priority would be to consider yield curve control. So that's a step on from QE. That's for the Bank of England to decide we want long-term interest rates to, say, for example, be around 1%, and we'll buy bonds to ensure that they stay at that level. The next steps of monetary financing or even a helicopter drop seem to me well outside of the current set of requirements and throw up the danger that there would be an unstable demand for money in the economy and potentially lead to instability later on down the line, which doesn't fit in with the overriding constraint for monetary policy, which we think is a normal service commitment. Monetary policy should provide state contingent support for fiscal policy, but at the end of that, there should be agreements that it returns to its fundamental objective, which is to ensure price and monetary stability. I'll leave you before turning to Amit from some wise words from a great friend of ours, who unfortunately we lost directly because of COVID-19, Peter Sinclair, who in a paper for the Review 3 years ago argued that monetary policy should do no harm. And that's something which we agree with very much. And now, if I may, like to turn to Amit Kara, who will, with the help of all the work having done by the team, in fact, I should have congratulated them for a wonderful effort to be able to construct a forecast using an equation, a model of several thousand equations remotely in various parts of the country. Amit, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jagjit. So let me start by just outlining some of the main points of our forecast. So we see world GDP falling by 3.5% this year, and then bouncing back by 7% next year. Just to place this in perspective, I mean, on average, world GDP tends to grow by about 3.5% every year. So this, in effect, or at least for this year, it's something like a 7 percentage point swing down. Inflation, we have revised lower our forecast for inflation this year, mainly because of activity, but also because of falling oil and commodity prices. But in the medium term, the outlook for inflation is uncertain. Now, as Jagjit mentioned, our forecast is built around some very specific assumptions. So the most important of these is that we believe, at least in the forecast, that the peak of the pandemic will occur in the second quarter of this year, and over the course of the year, the impact will fade away. In other words, what we are saying is that there's not going to be a repeat infection later on at all. So what does this mean in terms of the modeling? So we've used the National Institute's NIGEM model, and we've basically hit the model with three shocks. So a demand shock to consumption and investment, a supply shock where we've assumed that people don't work for 3 months. We've also made an adjustment to productivity, which is more severe in the second quarter. And then on the flip side, we've injected some stimulus, which is essentially based on the announcements so far. And on our count, the fiscal measures have been to the tune of about 2.5% of GDP, and they have helped reduce the GDP loss by around 1/3. So where does this take us? I mean, you can see the chart on the left-hand side, which shows our kind of main, sort of main projection for a handful of countries. So for example, China is, the line for China is on top. You can see China continuing to grow and and that's in essence because its potential growth rate is higher. But other countries which have a lower potential growth rate will see outright falls in output. Now, what is going to drive the difference in the short and in the medium term will be a number of factors. So, the sort of structural makeup of the economy is important. So, for example, if the economy is heavily dependent on tourism, is likely to be hit more and for longer. The policy space that's available to a country is also important. And related to that is, at least for the EM world or emerging markets, is the record outflow of portfolio money. According to IIF, about $100 billion has exited from the emerging world in the last 2 months, and that is unprecedented. And of course, that restricts the policy options that are available to emerging economies. The chart on the right-hand side seeks to sort of highlight the huge uncertainty around our forecast. This is different from the sort of standard fan charts that we produce, which tend to start from the point at which the forecast start, which is the dotted line. In this case, you can see the fan sort of opening up towards the end of the year. And essentially what we're trying to show in this chart is what would world GDP look like if the pandemic hits us again at the end of this year. And you can see very clearly that our main forecast is significantly above anything that's within the fan. So in other words, the risks to our main forecast are very solidly to the downside. Okay, turning next to policy. Jagjit's also already mentioned there's been a range of sort of conventional and unconventional policy measures that central banks and fiscal authorities have taken. And this includes, specific interventions in markets that have become dislocated, and also financial stability measures as well. These, a good discussion of at least the US measures is published in a National Institute discussion paper recently. I will also spend a few minutes later on talking about spillovers. In essence, what is the impact of measures then of the lockdown in other countries on each other? And in the kind of key message there is that small open economies are particularly exposed. I will also say a few words about debt levels. Debt levels have risen across both developing and developed economies over the last 5 years, and there are particular vulnerabilities within the household and corporate sector. Okay, let me just spend the next 3-4 charts putting this current economic forecast into perspective. So I'll start with GDP. I mentioned that we expect world GDP to fall by 3.5% this year. This compares to a drop of just 0.1% during the financial crisis, so much bigger. Also, the drop this year is faster than the global financial crisis, and indeed, it's even faster than what happened during the Great Depression. The second point to note is, again, the one that Jagjit's made, that we expect the level of GDP to remain low for a prolonged period of time because of scarring. And of course, the phasing of the recovery is important because some countries will come out faster than others. Next, I just want to show you a chart that you're probably familiar with already, and it's U.S. New unemployment claims. These just in 2 weeks they rose by more than 15 million. This is again unprecedented. And here again, I will refer you to a paper by Bell and Blanchflower in the review this time. The other point that is worth emphasizing is this portfolio outflow. I mentioned the 100 billion in 2 months, and you can see that in the black line in this chart. And if you compare that with the red line, which shows the same story for the global financial crisis, and it's very obviously significantly larger. In fact, it's about 3 times larger. And it's no surprise that more than 100 countries have approached the IMF for emergency financing already. And then finally, I just want to place the policy response in perspective. So I think it's fair to say that the policy response this time has been fast. I think it's fair to say that it's been bigger, certainly for the G7. But I think it's also right to say that it's been largely uncoordinated. Perhaps the only exception is the swap lines that central banks have set up. But this is quite different from the global financial crisis. I think some of you might recall that at the G20 London summit, there was a recognition that the global financial crisis was a huge challenge. And in response, leaders agreed to a fiscal injection of about $5 trillion, which actually did happen. This time it's been largely uncoordinated. Also, I think the fiscal response that during the global financial crisis was phased in over 3 years. This time it's likely to be much faster, and there may be more to come as well. And the third point here is that it is bigger, particularly for the G7, but as far as the G20 is concerned, it's not bigger. And I think that probably relates to the fiscal and other space, or the policy space more generally, that other countries in the G20 have this time. Okay, next, I just want to, so there's a box in the review, box A, which outlines the debt position of various countries around the world. And I just want to highlight a few points from that box. Now, the table on the left-hand side shows debt for each of these countries, and it splits them into 3 groups, government, households, and corporates. And the shaded numbers there are essentially those where debt levels have actually gone up over compared to 5 years ago. And in essence, I mean, the main message there is that debt has gone up pretty much everywhere in both advanced economies and emerging economies. Another point to note is that debt levels are significantly higher in developed economies, 129 trillion, compared to 58 trillion in emerging economies. The chart on the right-hand side shows that credit conditions have tightened because corporate spreads have sharply increased, and this is undoubtedly going to place significant pressure on corporates in both developed and developing countries, and we can expect a wave of defaults over the next few weeks and months. There is a big question related to public sector debt. Public sector debt is almost certainly will rise by about 20 to 30% in many countries. And the question is, what do governments do with that debt? Do they tolerate it, or do they embark on another fiscal consolidation plan? I now want to just turn to spillovers, and I think this is an important piece of work that we carried out in NIESR. So the question that we're asking ourselves in this exercise is, what is the spillover impact of measures taken in other countries on measures taken across the world on any particular country? So the bottom line here is that spillovers amplify the shock. And on our count, it's about 60%. So in other words, what we are saying is that if all the countries in the world impose measures that reduce GDP by 1%, then if the domestic impact is 1%, then the global impact of all these measures will magnify that domestic impact, and growth will be about 1.6% lower once we account for spillovers. You can see that in both these charts. The chart at the bottom highlights some of the sort of smaller open economies, particularly those in the euro area. And you can see that the impact, so you compare the red line with the pink and the gray line. The red line is the domestic impact. The pink and the gray line is the cumulative global impact. And you can see that the global impact is significantly larger for smaller open economies. And in fact, the pink line relates to countries in the euro area. And essentially, the point here is that these countries are so integrated, are very closely integrated, and any lockdown in other euro area or European Union countries will have a material impact on their growth prospects as well. So what's next? Well, I think policy, as I mentioned, has not been coordinated so far, but going forward, there is a need to coordinate policy. I think many of the measures that I've listed here are fairly obvious. I mean, the most important of these is addressing the health pandemic itself, but also the resistance to trade barriers, and more specifically, measures that will restore confidence in developing countries. I think there is also a big issue in the euro area, and I think we believe that both the ECB, the ESM, and other institutional frameworks need to play a supportive role for countries like Italy and Greece that have a very limited fiscal space. And finally, I think we haven't really talked very much about inflation over the medium term, but this is absolutely critical in the way debt will be managed both in the private sector and in the public sector, and specifically also in emerging markets. I'll stop there with our forecast. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Amit. That's a lot of material you covered very clearly. Thank you very much for that. I'd now like to introduce Gary Young, who's Deputy Director of the Institute, who will go through our UK view. He warned us a little bit earlier on that his internet connection is a little bit unstable, so Cyril Leonel, who has also written this chapter with him, is on standby, should he be required. Gary.
Thank you very much, Jagjit, and good morning, everyone. I'd just like to thank Cyril for his contribution to this chapter as well. So in terms of the headlines of our UK forecast, the economic outlook is extremely uncertain, and obviously going to depend critically on the path of COVID-19 and how that pans out. Our conditioning assumption is that we start to ease the lockdown from around the middle of next month, and that there is no significant recurrence of the virus after that. So obviously that assumption is very risky. In terms of the GDP effect, it's almost certain that GDP will fall in 2020, and there's a material risk of a further fall in 2021, although that's not our main case. In terms of the central forecast, or the main case forecast scenario, as we call it, we would have public sector borrowing rising above 200 billion in this year, even with a relatively short lockdown. Unemployment would rise above 10% by the end of the year, with the rise limited by the furlough scheme. So the furlough scheme is preventing unemployment going up by even more than that. In terms of the lockdown and how it should be eased, we've done some thinking about that and argue that it should be eased, first of all, in the upstream sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing, construction, and retail, so that demand can then flow down to the other sectors of the economy. We also make the point that some of the more significant challenges are likely to be when the lockdown is eased and the government measures begin to be withdrawn. So in terms of the risks, as I alluded to there, the outlook is very uncertain and precarious. The uncertainty is massive. So in the left-hand chart, we show a fan chart for the forecast we produced this time, and compare that on the same scale with a fan chart we produced only 3 months ago for our February review. At the time in February, we were more concerned about how the Brexit negotiations would go and whether there would be a no trade deal Brexit at the end of this year, which would pose big risks for the economy. But as you can see, the sort of scale of the uncertainty that we had in mind then pales into insignificance compared to the uncertainty that we have at the moment. The left-hand chart on the black line shows our central case forecast with output falling by 7% in 2020 and then rising again by 7% in 2021. But we have obviously no confidence that that will be the outcome. The risks around it are extremely large. And you might ask, though, why are we bothering to do a forecast with such uncertainty around it? I think the benefit of doing a forecast is it helps us to think through the scale of the shock, some of its implications and costs, and what policies we can put in place to improve the situation. I mean, forecasting is never really so much about the future, it's more about what you can do now to make the future a bit better. In terms of our main case forecast, this shows the difference in GDP in our forecast this time, in our central case this time, with the forecast we had in our central case last time. So GDP in pounds terms, or in 2016 pounds, I should say, is 175 billion lower this year compared to what we had been expecting 3 months ago. In 2021, it's lower by almost 80 billion and so on in future years. So there is some permanent effect of the crisis that we're going through at the moment. In terms of the numbers, GDP in the central case retains its sort of end of 2019 values at the end of next year. But there is some permanent scarring, and if you add up, if you accumulate the loss of output over the next 10 years, GDP is 800 billion smaller than it would have been, which is about 3.5% over that 10-year period. In terms of what's happening at the moment, so in the first half of 2020, we produced analysis of monthly GDP recently, and in our GDP tracker, we estimated a GDP fall of 5% in Q1 and 15 to 25% in Q2, depending on the duration of the lockdown. Now, our detailed sectoral analysis points to a 30% loss of output when the economy is in lockdown. So really the forecast just depends partly on the duration of that lockdown. In terms of what we're seeing in terms of the data, there is really no hard data at the moment. There was retail sales figures for March, but that's about it. Other indicators such as electricity usage, which is shown in the chart on the left, this shows electricity consumption compared to the pre-COVID-19 forecast put together by the National Grid. You can see that there's quite a reduction there, around 20% in the morning periods and 10% at peak periods. We know that travel is down massively. We know that universities and schools are all closed, although there's obviously some activity going on there, but it's obvious that the economy activity is much less than it had been before. In an ONS survey, the ONS have done a great job in producing these surveys, and they found that 25% of businesses had temporarily closed, and of those that remained open, 38% have reported that turnover was substantially lower than normal. And then the flash composite output PMI was 12.9 in April, a record low. And the main surprise with that figure is how come 12.9% of companies said they were producing more in April than they were in March. In terms of the turnaround in GDP growth, the chart on the left shows the quarterly profile in our main case forecast scenario. A big fall in Q2 followed by a rise in Q3, which is slightly reminiscent of the picture, as Jagjit mentioned, in 1921, almost exactly 100 years ago, when the economy was in a post-World War I slump. And then there was a miners' strike as well on top of that in the second quarter, which meant that output was estimated, there was obviously no quarterly data at the time, but people had subsequently estimated output fall of 12.5% or something in the second quarter, and then a bounce back in the quarter after that. And so that would be a relatively good outcome. As I said, we're not confident of seeing that. In terms of the channels, it's useful to think about how the shock is working through the economy in terms of what policies can be put in place to improve the situation. So there are various supply and demand channels which I've listed in this slide. So there's lower productivity and hours of work from those who have jobs because of illness, self-isolation, and having to look after children while schools are closed. I mean, lower productivity is an assumption there that because people are away, teams can't do their jobs properly, but there will definitely be reduced hours of work from people who are ill. I think the ONS estimated that's about 5%. And then if you think about people who are having to look after school-aged children, that'd be another 10% while schools are closed who can't work. So that's just a pure supply side shock, labour supply shock. In addition to that, there'll be lower activity in the lockdown, which we can all see around us, which is a sort of supply and a demand shock. Then there is a pure demand shock as a result of precautionary saving and investment being affected by uncertainty and firms deferring any planned investment. So that's a demand shock. And then you have obviously lower demand and supply from abroad. So the lower demand is because of the fact that other countries are going through the same situation as we are, and lower supply because of unavailability of parts for firms in global supply chains. And then there's also lower risk appetite, which is, as one of Amit's charts showed, is pushing up the spreads on lending and would lead to other things equal, a higher cost of capital. So those channels of supply and demand effects obviously amplify each other, but they can also counteract each other to some extent. So the fact that we have lower demand from abroad probably matters less when the economy is in lockdown, when firms aren't in a position to supply anyway, than it would do when we're not in lockdown, which is one of the reasons why we think that there's some of the sort of more negative demand effects likely to come through when the lockdown is eased. Obviously, the main constraint at the moment is the lockdown, and there's a question then about how that could be eased in a fairly smart way to get the economy working again. So in terms of that, this chart shows some sort of preliminary work we've done with a preliminary model we've been developing at the Institute called a dynamic sectoral model, which is a sort of macroeconomic model, a fairly standard macro model, but has sectoral details within it. So there's 9 sectors within the model. And they trade, and there's sort of, and this is all based on the ONS supply and use tables. So they trade with each other and supply each other or demand from each other intermediate outputs of goods and services. So in terms of what the chart shows, it shows, imagine a lockdown which is affecting a sector on its own. So that's what the red bars show, is the impact of a particular shock, which is of a lockdown which lasts about half of a quarter, so 6 to 7 weeks. It's the impact of that shock on the output of that sector because of the lockdown. That's the red bars, and the black bars shows what happens if you put all of those different lockdowns together, and you can see that the effects are much bigger once you take account of the spillovers across sectors due to the fact that if output is lower in a particular sector, there'll be less factor incomes for people to spend, but also there'll be less demand for intermediates from other sectors. And you can see that I hadn't made any assumption that there would be any effect in finance, for example, because of the assumptions made that people can work from home in that sector. But finance would still suffer a lack of demand when the other sectors are in lockdown, because obviously firms are not needing so much investment banking advice, for example, when they're locked down. Maybe they need more, but in the model they need less. And so what this points to is that in this particular case, an enforced reduction in activity of 15% in GDP terms could spill over to reduce activity overall by 25%. And then it also helps you to think about how the sequencing of easing the lockdown might work best. And what it points to is easing the lockdown first in the upstream sectors, which are creating demand for the downstream sectors. And this is particularly the case when people in the downstream sectors, such as finance and perhaps some of the private traded sectors like consultancy and so on, are in a better position to work from home than people in construction and manufacturing, for example. On top of that effect, then there's also been, as everyone knows, significant fiscal measures to help deal with the lockdown. In the table on the left, we've sort of quantified how much those add up to. Obviously, these are very difficult to estimate. We don't know how long the lockdown is going to last, so we can't really be sure about how much the job retention scheme will cost. But it would be 20 billion if 4 million people get £5,000 each through the scheme, and these all tot up to around 75 billion pounds, which, as I say, is an uncertain estimate of the direct fiscal cost of these measures. And then the chart on the right shows the impact of those fiscal measures when it's run through the NIESR model to estimate how much GDP is different when there is a policy response and when there isn't a policy response. So, whereas GDP might have fallen by 10% without the policy responses, it's fallen by 8% with the policy responses. Obviously, the main effect of a lot of these measures is not really to affect GDP, because when the economy is locked down, you can't do anything about that. It's more to make sure that people have an income and they can get by when the lockdown is in place. But obviously, those measures and the fact that the economy is smaller, so that tax revenue will be smaller, means that borrowing will rise sharply. It's almost certain to rise above 200 billion this year. And if it did, then that would push the debt to GDP ratio up to about 95%, which is 12 percentage points higher than we'd expected it. 12 percentage points higher than it was last year. This is, of course, very uncertain, and if some of the downside risks materialise, then the effect is likely to be bigger. In our forecast, the counterpart to the higher public sector borrowing is higher private sector saving, because largely because people are unable to consume what they'd want to consume. So the effect, the public sector is borrowing not from future generations, but from those people who are alive at the moment who are unable to spend more because of the lockdown, and whose savings are therefore rising sharply. Now, the asset purchases by the bank mean that borrowing or new borrowing is effectively at bank rate, 0.1%. But it's also meaning that as a consequence of the fact that the bank is buying up the gilts, that there are more short-term monetary assets in private sector portfolios, which of course then poses a risk for the future, that there may be higher monetary growth, which there may be a risk of higher inflation, although our central forecast is that inflation will be lower, and so that those monetary assets will be willingly held in private sector portfolios. Unemployment is set to rise sharply, but the coronavirus job retention scheme, CJRS, is helping to limit that rise in unemployment. The very useful ONS survey indicates that 27% of employees in the businesses who responded to the survey had been furloughed. So there's a lot of people being furloughed in the economy, in the private sector of the economy at the moment. Nevertheless, we still expect unemployment on the sort of official definition, with furloughed people not being counted within official unemployment, to rise sharply. There had been 1.8 million new universal credit claims between early March and mid-April, and all of those will flow into unemployment. I think some people think that some of those claims were sort of put in place speculatively before people knew that they would be furloughed, and so they won't necessarily become unemployed. But nevertheless, in our main case, we're expecting unemployment to rise above 10% by the end of this year, which would be the highest rate since the early 90s. Now, the challenge is going to come after the lockdown. So we're going to be in a period before a vaccine is available, when we want to maintain social distancing, and so there won't be any lockdown even if a large number of people are going back to work. And the challenge obviously for many businesses will be to survive when social distancing means that they're going to have fewer customers that they can safely supply. So if you think about pubs where people are normally jam-packed, with, sort of ones that we come across in London, and obviously they're going to have fewer customers, but they may well need similar, they will have to have similar levels of costs. So we think the job retention scheme will need to be adapted in that situation. So instead of people paying people to be on furlough when they're doing nothing, you may have to top up their wages if the firms won't be able to, if the businesses won't be able to afford to pay full salaries. It's also likely to be the case that we'll need more conventional fiscal policy measures once the sort of efficiency of demand becomes more apparent. So when people are allowed to supply goods and services, they may discover that there isn't enough demand for them, and that will be the time for a more conventional fiscal policy response. And luckily, the government was planning to level up the economy, so it should have been thinking of fiscal policy measures, useful fiscal policy measures that could be implemented, and it would be obviously important for some of those to come on stream. Now, I've talked a lot about the risks of the forecasts, and it is a very uncertain forecast, but obviously what policy is trying to do is to make sure that we can build a bridge from where we were to where we want to be sometime next year. And so it's key then to ensure that the complex network of relationships that make up the modern economy can be preserved. In terms of the main case forecast scenario, as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. This is a plausible scenario rather than a confident prediction, but we have GDP falling by 7% this year, rising by 7% next year. We have inflation somewhere between 0 and 2%, unemployment rising to over 10 by the end of this year, and then falling back some of the way to where it was before next year. Have bank rate remaining very low, with the Bank of England keeping its foot on the floor at the accelerator. As I said, well, I didn't say, but I'll say it now, the current account of the balance of payments actually improves in 2020 because imports fall by more than exports. And that sort of points to the fact that the counterpart of the extra public sector borrowing is extra private sector saving. And the borrowing, as I mentioned, is above 10% of GDP this year and then falls back next year. So that's a summary of where we are.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gary, for a comprehensive and robust view about where we are. I'm going to ask Amit and Rachel to join again on the video online. Perhaps, Rachel, you can help us field questions as they come in. We have 15 or so minutes to deal with questions, and I look forward to being able to answer them as best we can between us.
Yes, absolutely. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you just want to use the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your screen. Lovely. And then at the start, if you could just say your name and affiliation, and I'll give you permission to speak. So we've got the first question from Alistair Milne. I'll just unmute you.
Yep, I'm unmuted. You can hear
me?
Lovely.
Thanks, Alistair.
I'm always jumping in.
Hello, Alistair. How are you?
Very well. We're angels fear to tread. Quickly occurred to me about the fiscal multiplier. I just wonder if you could comment a bit more on that. It also occurred to me they're likely to be quite varied depending on the type of fiscal policy. It actually occurs to me that certain types of additional tax revenue might actually have a quite low fiscal multiplier at the moment. But just more elaboration on that point.
Yes, of course. I'll give a very brief answer. I think we'll do these in sequence rather than collecting them up, which is our normal, a normal MO, as it were. I guess I'm harking back to the work that was being done 10 years ago or so. You may remember all kinds of work done at the time to look at the fiscal multiplier, and you'll remember that the results very much depend upon your view on long-term supply elasticity, confidence, and the availability of finance. And so what we have in our mind is that if there is a sudden and rapid fall in demand, providing supply has been maintained by the kind of networks that Gary was alluding to. And particularly if we can concentrate on the areas in which we think there is capacity to build the economy, and that harks back to the levelling up agenda, we're looking in certain areas where expenditures we think would have profound long-term fiscal multipliers. We've done some work, as usual, on the kinds of things that have a fiscal multiplier, and investment is clearly one. So again, if we could look at the national infrastructure list of investments and see which ones could be kicked off quickly in the areas and regions where we think there is requirements to be made, that would be a very good place to start. So I think that's where we are at the moment. I can't give you exact numbers, but I would think expenditure in investment in the regions when lockdowns start to ease would be a very good idea for government to be thinking about. And I'm not terribly concerned that the multiplier would be a half or something. It would be well over 1 in those areas. Rachel, next question.
Lovely, thank you, Alistair. So our next question is from Jeff Tilley. I'll just allow you to talk as well and unmute you.
Hello, Jeff, how are you?
Just having a little difficulty unmuting Jeff.
That's very unusual for Jeff, I've got to say.
How about that? Does that work?
Yes, that's perfect. We can hear you now.
There was something from me required. So I was just thanking you for the discussion. I think it's a very valuable event, and you're also all looking very smart, I have to say. I guess I've got my concern is that there's a tendency to write off potential with your sort of level shift, and I do wonder if a sort of a bigger, more vigorous fiscal stimulus might deal with that. I liked your examination of the post-1920 of the 1920s. I wondered if you'd done a similar thing on post-1945, what that might tell you about potential. And then lastly, just in terms of a quick fiscal stimulus, why not a big rise in public sector pay? That would seem to be very quick acting. Thank you.
Jeff, can you remind us who you work for?
Just one of a number of bodies who are interested in the performance of the economy.
Come on, out with it, lad. Who do you work for?
Sorry, didn't I say I work for the Trades Union Congress?
Right, okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure that's just fair information for everyone. Gary, would you like to come back on any of those points?
Well, I think they're very good questions. I don't have a, I think just as the sort of outlook is uncertain, so is some of the response of the economy to policy stimulus might be uncertain. I can certainly believe there are situations where there would be a more vigorous fiscal expansion when it's safe to do so, would push the level up back to where it was more quickly. So, or even, well, perhaps not beyond where it was before, but I can certainly believe there could be potential for some endogenous productivity improvement as well on that. But on public sector pay, that's an interesting suggestion. I'm not sure I'd go along with that one.
Well, okay. I think it's just we go to the next question. Jeff, we'll continue our conversations as we have, and we always do. But thank you for that question, Jeff. Shall we move on to the next one?
Lovely. The next question is from Nick G.
Nick G. Okay.
Nick, are you there?
Yeah. Hi, it's Nick Greenstock from Gatehouse, and we work with Llewellyn Partners on the policy document with you, Jagjit.
Of course, Nick. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And thank you to all of NIESR for this fantastic and helpful conversation. Our question is actually around money supply, M2 particularly, and looking at the potential for inflation. You've been quite sanguine on inflation, and just to get a sense of where you think the inflation picture might go as money supply picks up. And the second part to that question is around the role of banks and the potential for kind of fiscal policy and fiscal policy levers to not just be around interest rate and inflation targeting, but also to think about leverage ratios and the potential to use banks' balance sheets to create greater liquidity at the ground level. So bringing back support for businesses at that more base level.
Okay. Gary, would you like to say something about how we constructed our inflation profile and what you think the risks are to that? And I could say something very briefly on the banking sector. These are very big questions, Nick, and we should continue to pursue them with you, I think. But we'll give brief answers now, if we may.
Thank you.
Gary.
No, I think it's a very good question. I mean, I don't want to answer all these questions by saying everything is uncertain, and I don't know. But I think there is a sort of there is a huge risk around the inflation outlook. You know, obviously in both directions. I mean, in terms of you know, I put together the slide showing whether the different channels of the way the virus affects the economy, and there are demand and supply shocks there. I think the judgment that most policymakers have made is that the demand shocks are outweighing the supply shocks. But you know, that may well change as we go forward. And on top of that, as you know, we don't do a forecast explicitly of how the money supply is going to develop. But you know, I certainly can see with QE going on at the rate it is that broad money probably will expand quite rapidly. And then the question will be whether that money is willingly held, you know, when the lockdown eases, and you know, people who have been able to save through the crisis then have a lot of liquid assets, will they want to spend them? So I think that, you know, you can construct reasons why inflation may be more vigorous going forward. And I don't know if Amit wants to come in on that, because I think he's been thinking about this on the world side as well.
Yes, do, Amit. I think you've got some points to make on EMs there, I think.
Sure. So, I mean, this relates to emerging markets and inflation expectations. And the point I want to sort of emphasize is that inflation expectations appear incredibly well anchored in developed economies. And whilst inflation has fallen quite dramatically in emerging economies as well, that's been a much more recent phenomena. And I think the disruption to supply chains and the fact that it's only a very recent phenomena might imply that that the risk to higher inflation is somewhat more elevated in emerging countries than in developed markets. And also, I mean, you know, there is likely to be this pressure against globalization, which could also exert some kind of upward pressure again in emerging economies.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Nick, if I may, can I point you on the question of the banking system? Of course, first and foremost, this is an economic shock affecting households and firms. And as Gary pointed out, the banks are downstream from that. But I think there is a case for banks to support SMEs. And in the process of writing the review, we had a good look at the early 1920s, as you've noticed. And one of the interesting things there is that the view was taken that recovery in the early 1920s was slowed because of something called the Macmillan Gap. That was the inability of the financial sector to support small and medium enterprises in the recovery period. So plus ça change, I think, in this case. But Nick, let's take up that point on the banking sector and how it can support recovery jointly very soon. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you.
Lovely. Our next question is from Francis Hack from Santander.
Francis, how are you? Oh, we'll wait.
Just unmuting as you.
Okay,
there we
that's
go.
quite right.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I hopefully you can hear me now.
Of course, Francis, how are you?
I'm very good. Yes,
Good.
not too bad. Working from home is an interesting experience with two children. But thank you very much.
That's one word. I can think of others.
I'm trying to be polite.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much for this. It's very helpful. I had one question around, I mean, not only obviously have we got the COVID crisis to deal with, but there is the potential for Brexit to rear its head yet again.
What's that? Well,
towards the end of the year. Yes, I know. We all was hoping that we might get away from this, but I just wondered what assumptions the teams have made in terms of Brexit, at least for the UK economy, for this year.
It's a very fair question, and it's one that we kind of knew was coming. We didn't know you'd ask it, but we knew it was coming. So I'm going to duck it completely and pass it to Gary.
Thanks.
No, the answer, Francis, is that we've assumed that that there is a successful negotiation of a free trade agreement, and that everything is sort of done and dusted by the end of the year. But obviously, that is another hugely uncertain, risky assumption too. But yeah, we just sort of made it convenience, really, because we wanted to sort of try and move on a bit from Brexit and get, we could get Brexit done even if nobody else could.
Excellent. Let's hope so.
Well, yes. Thank you, Francis, for that question. And do keep in touch, and we're always happy to chat with you if you need to talk outside of the realms of this meeting.
Lovely, thank
let's
you.
go to the next question, Rachel.
Lovely. The next one is from John Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes, John.
There we go.
John Fitzgerald, Esri and Trinity College Dublin. You're showing a 9 percentage point of GDP rise in personal savings in the UK, and I suspect the numbers across Northern Europe will be rather similar. And then that reverses next year and gives you the recovery. Given that consumers have built up their savings because they're rationed, we haven't really experienced this since the Second World War. Is there a possibility that they may hold on to their savings? It's sort of that they have excess savings. Are they going to spend them? Could you see an even bigger expansion next year, or could continued rationing of consumers in terms of travel and tourism delay the recovery to 2022?
Thank you, John. Good to hear from you. I hope everything's well over there. Always good to hear from you. Gary, I know we had a discussion about the savings of consumers in light of the shock this year and next. And clearly what John outlines is a risk to that. I think it's one that we share. Perhaps you'd just like to comment on his question and possibly agree with it, but can I just ask you to respond?
Well, I do agree with the sentiment. I think, people who have built up, savings through the crisis are not likely to be able to go and splurge them next year. If they can't travel, and they're reluctant to go to pubs and restaurants and so on. So I could well imagine that there would be a deficiency of demand next year for that reason. Not sure really what else to say about that. Obviously one way of taking the savings off them is to tax them in some way to sort of start thinking about paying for the deficit. I can imagine some governments being a bit gung-ho about doing that, but so I hope they don't. But that may be one way in which some of the savings are reduced more quickly.
Okay, but I suppose if we're otherwise back to approaching normal, then that's the case for fiscal policy as well. The point you were talking about in terms of more fiscal action at that time. Would that be right, Gary? Yeah. Okay. Well, John, thank you very much. Do keep in touch and give my regards to everyone at Esri. I think we've just gone past the hour, but let's take one more question, if we might, Rachel. I'll leave you to choose. Who's the lucky person?
Lovely. So you've got one more question from John Geeve.
Yes. Well, we can't we can't refuse John Geeve a question. John, how are you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well. I hope you're well.
Well, I had sort of two questions. I thought that Gary's comparison of his February forecast with his current forecast raised again the question of what's the purpose of the fan chart. When we several times now we've seen that the world's a lot more uncertain than that suggests. I suppose the other question I've got is are we testing or are we not testing the limits of government expansionary policy? We've had monetary policy at historically unprecedented level of expansionariness over the last 10 years. We're now adding to that fiscal policy, and you're encouraging us to go further on fiscal policy. Can you print your way out of these sorts of problems?
Well, excellent questions, I expect, from John. John, you're currently chair of NIESR, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Amongst other gongs, no doubt. So, Gary, this is a debate we often have about the usefulness of fan charts. I think you alluded to an answer. Perhaps you could, provide a little bit more for John to understand why we think about risk and uncertainty in this way and how helpful it is. I personally find it incredibly helpful to be able to say that this is the risk that we saw both downside and in absolute magnitude, and this is now the risk that we see. This is, assume, a sequence of estimates of the risk that we see, and in that sense is incredibly helpful. And I think we've also done a lot of work in the last 4 years understanding how firms have reduced investment directly in proportion to the amount of uncertainty we're measuring. So, you know, when we're measuring this uncertainty and risk, it has real consequences, and that is the firm level behaviour. But Gary, let me ask you to add to that if you can.
Well, I mean, I think the fan chart is a useful device to sort of highlight the limits of our knowledge really around things. I mean, I see forecasters as not being, you know, like people who put in bets on horse races, but more like the bookies who are giving some sort of sense of what the odds are. And, you know, obviously our sense of the odds back in February was completely wrong. You could have made a lot of money out by betting against us. But, you know, I think it is helpful to give some sense of the limits of what we know when we're putting forward a forecast. You know, our forecast is really is not so much about what's going to happen, but it's about what policies you can think of to make sure that the outcomes are not as bad as you can perhaps envisage. So that's my simple answer on that one.
Thank you, Gary. John's other question on, I think Amit just wants to come in on, is it the fiscal policy question? Amit, would you like to give an answer to John in terms of, you know, where fiscal policy is going now at neutral interest rates that are so low, and the role of monetary policy at this time? I don't think anyone's talking about printing money, John, if I could just pick you on that point. It's not something we're in favour of or asking for. I think it's all about resource transfers, either between currently alive households or as a trade with future households. I think it is all got to observe some notion of a present value budget constraint for the government and the consolidated balance sheet. So I wouldn't think that anyone's talking about printing money. But Amit, would you like to come back on other aspects of that question?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the question sort of was about the limits to sort of fiscal policy. How far can we go with this? And I think a lot of it will depend on how inflation evolves and how inflation expectations evolve. I mean, we know from Japan, for example, that you can go on and on and on. I mean, they themselves have embarked on a massive fiscal expansion program in response to COVID this time. You know, so, and I think we also need to ask the question about, well, what if there isn't any aggregate private sector aggregate demand coming? What is the option? If we are willing to tolerate higher levels of unemployment or significantly lower wages. So I think at the end of the day, I mean, you know, if we can inflate our way out of this problem, that may be a good thing, but it's a risky thing as well, because, you know, how far higher can you tolerate inflation to go without dislodging expectations?
Okay, thank you, Amit. We're about to wind up, but I think we've had two-handers. So Rachel, if we can just take these two questions, as it were, in a row, and then we'll try to answer them, then just sum up and try to finish by 10 past. Would that be okay, Rachel?
Yes, absolutely. So it's three final questions we have from
three. Okay.
Kashab, Golnar and Keith. So if we can take them in that order.
Yeah. Well, perhaps they could just say, I don't necessarily know where they work, but if they could give their affiliation when they ask their question as well, that would be great.
That would be great. Just unmuting Kashab.
Okay.
You might have to just press unmute on your screen as well. Okay, maybe we might have lost Kashab. Golnar,
okay.
Are you there? Would you like to ask your question? Or we could jump to Keith if you're there.
Let's go for Keith.
Is that okay now?
Yes, I think we need, if we've got everyone there, we can start with Kashab instead again.
Thank you. My question is about the regional...
Is this Kashab, the professor from Hull?
I am from University of Hull. This is a wonderful assessment for the UK economy and the global economy. I mean, in the context of the COVID-19, we have heard a lot of discussion about the different impact by regions, locations, or different section communities and like that. So, given that the unemployment rate is projected to be 10%, what sort of policies promoting growth in the regional level can bring back that unemployment rate down to a more reasonable 6%, as you mentioned, 21.
Okay, thank you, Keshab. Next question.
Gona, can we take your question now?
Yes.
Lovely, ask away.
Okay. I'm wondering if there is any kind of like an interdisciplinary working group, including the medical doctors and the economists, because I understand the need for distancing between the people, but there could be other ways without shutting down certain sectors and without slowing down both the demand and the supply in others. So it's kind of like a knowledge question. Is there any working group as such that can balance the two? Because this is a virus, and 5 years later, 2 years later, there could be another virus coming on. It's a very global world now. People travel.
Very good. Rachel, I didn't quite catch the name.
Gona, could you give us your full name and affiliation, please?
It's Gülnur Muradoglu, Queen Mary, University of London.
Thank you very much.
And the third question?
And our final question is from Keith Pilbeam. Keith, are you there?
Yeah.
Lovely, ask away.
Yeah, so Keith Pilbeam, City University.
Okay, how are you, mate? You all right? Yeah.
Right, my thing is, I see, when I look at your central forecast there, I see a V. And most people I've been talking to are seeing a U. And it could be quite a long U, because there's going to be a lot of sackings. It's going to take time to feed into all those sackings. Going to be lots of cuts in investments and things like that. So I'm a bit skeptical of this V, and I see much more of a U, and quite a long U.
Yeah. Well, we've had VWs, we've had all kinds of things. I think you can get the whole alphabet in Gary's fan chart there. I think that's the idea. But let's we've gone past 10 past. I think the questions are onto interdisciplinary. If I could talk about that, Vilma, that's a quite excellent comment. It's something that we're trying to get off the ground, is a direct interaction between the epidemiologists and what we think of as their deterministic models, and how we may get different outcomes by understanding the sectoral work that the Institute is doing, as well as the way people interact with rules and decide to endogenously social distance as well. So we're trying to make progress as fast as we can on bringing together, the economic modelling, the interactions that might work, the fiscal policies that I think Keshab alluded to, and where that might work in particular regions, particularly if there are lockdowns at the regional level as well, how that might interact with people working on behaviour, and how that might also provide different outcomes for the economy depending upon the different paths of the virus over time. So I hope to be able to report back on that well before the next time we come together for an Economist briefing. But Gary, is there any point you want to make on Keith's letters, VW, XYZ, or whatever else he was?
Right, I think, you answered it in the sense that the whole alphabet is contained within that fan chart, I think, and on top of that, the Greek alphabet and all other sorts of alphabets, if you think of them. There are enormous risks around it. Our central case, I just see as a plausible outcome, but in some ways, what I'd probably put more money on would be something like the fan chart that Amit showed, where our main case forecasts are conditioned on the virus sort of being, of people being able to work around the virus from now onwards. But in this fan chart on the right, what we're allowing for is a sort of random recurrence of the virus in different countries, which would obviously impact on activity there. So I think there is a sort of significant downside risk to the central case that we've put out here. And that's why we've sort of made the fan charts as wide as they are.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for joining us this morning. We very much enjoy talking to our peers, the economists at this briefing. It's the one we look forward to every quarter. Please don't feel you can't get in touch directly. We don't have to wait for another 3 months. There's a lot of work going on. We're trying to understand the impact of this terrible virus, home and abroad, on our families, and living through it in the way that we are in the lockdown is very hard for all of us. But if we talk and we think, maybe we can improve outcomes, and that's all the Institute is ever trying to do. Thank you very much. for joining us this morning. Hope to speak to you all very soon. Goodbye.